In a world as old as Lebanon, it's hard to find a story that hasn't already been told. This is a tiny country, and every inch of this landscape is dripping in some half-forgotten pain. It's a land of resurrection, but it's also one of regurgitation. And alongside those saints have always come back those same old sinners. But even within those patterns, some moments stand alone. Some atrocities are so grotesque that they have actually seeped into the soil. And for all the horrors that history has thrown at the Lebanese, it would be the cleansings of the Ottomans that would most stain it into the country we know today. In a land of resurrection, in the heart of a Frankenstein, the cruel reality is knowing that life can only ever exist thanks to death. And in the 1500s, that great dying came in the form of a Turkic, Greco, and in some ways Persian empire we now call the Ottomans. Growing out of a shattered Anatolia, they were one of the few survivors to outlast that great scramble of the post-Mongolian world. There they would cement their place as the newest extension of a conquest that had been happening for nearly 500 years. A conquest that had once inspired the Crusades, no less. But those days were gone. And by the 1500s, it wasn't the Pope nor the Great Khan that this region would fear, it was those Ottomans. Having strategically married into the Byzantine nobility and then taken their throne in Constantinople, that incoming sultan declared himself the new Caesar. They were Rome. Granted, Europe might reject that on claims of religious grounds, but it's not like Julius had been a Christian. Times change, empires change, and now they'd changed towards Islam. Which isn't to say that the people necessarily had. It would be many hundreds more years before the populations below them would take to the god of those new horse lord kings, and yet those horse lords would keep it all the same. To put it simply, from a practical political perspective, they kind of needed to. Islam was an imperial religion in a way that others simply couldn't be. Look at Spain, for example. It was a lot easier to rule over Christians in an Islamic empire than it was to rule over Muslims in a Christian one. Plus, and perhaps most importantly, their soldiers followed Islam. It was a major reason why they felt they were allowed to conquer. So, Roman or not, whether it was purely calculated or a genuine expression of faith, by claiming to be the standard bearers of the Sunni, they had given themselves a nearly endless cause for war. They were Rome and Mecca. They were Caesar and Caliph. That said, neither of those two groups would have really seen them as all that legitimate. How could they possibly compete with the Seljuks, who could trace their lineage directly to Ali himself? How could they be the caliphs if they had no connection to Mecca? The only way forward for those Ottomans was violence, and they would use it to its maximum effect. Once they conquered Mecca, they thought, then they'd see who had the courage to publicly disagree with their piety. And so, if only as a matter of geography, they began to conquer south, right into the heart of Syria and Lebanon, the first dominoes on the way towards the Holy Lands. And there, they would find their first true victims, the Alawites and the Druze. Just as soon as they'd met those Ottomans, the genocides began. The Sultan would claim it was a response to raids on caravans, or perhaps to a refusal to pay taxes, which I suppose in some ways was probably true. As a semi-independent, insular people, rebellion was never really far from their minds, but of course that's not why they were actually killed, it was just politics. For the ulema of Constantinople, there was no excuse small enough to begin this slaughter. They needed that opportunity to show their Sunni subjects that they'd eradicate the non-believers. And in Lebanon and Syria, they found it. The first genocide of the Ottomans began less than a year after their conquest. 1517 would see nearly all of Aleppo's Alawites corralled and slaughtered to the man. Their goal was nothing less than a full eradication, and for the most part it was achieved. In 1518, they'd come back for the Druze. In 23 and 24, they'd burn 73 villages to the ground, riding back to Constantinople with saddlebags overflowing with decapitated heads. Those who survived, they'd enslave. In a single expedition, over 300 women and children would be kidnapped and sold to whichever Sunni lord wanted them most. Many would take them as wives. Wave after violent wave would crash against these mountains, and with each great murder would come a resurrection, a new generation attempting to push back against this violent new lordship. But none would ever succeed. 1585 would see the worst year in Druze history, with 20,000 professional Ottoman soldiers sent to their mountain villages on a mission of true eradication, an unchecked genocide that didn't stop until there weren't even enough people here left to dream. But this is Lebanon, the land of the phoenix, and it's rare that something dies here that doesn't return. Especially the Druze. After all, that's the core of their religion. Surely one of the great comforts of believing in eternal reincarnation is knowing that even when your people are slaughtered to the last, you can still be sure that they're going to come back. Which, oddly enough, is kind of what happened, actually. Just as soon as those guns stopped firing, this little mountain community started to roar back to life. Or perhaps I should say at least the families who ruled over it did. Which brings me to the man whose name the algorithm would really prefer that I don't say. Let's call him al-Din. He was by far the most important Druze to ever grace this world, and by extension, perhaps one of the most important Lebanese people to ever exist in all history. Some would even argue that he's actually the first Lebanese person to exist. Although, that's a bit contentious, I suppose. But hey, he was a pretty contentious guy. His father had led the rebellion that had caused the worst slaughter of the Druze, and yet he'd waited out that violence from the safety of Constantinople, sucking up to the Sultan so hard that they even gave him his father's throne when it was all said and done. But whether it was craven or simply calculated, al-Din was nothing if not clever, and with that power over his people secured, he immediately set about rebuilding their shattered economy, planting the cash crops of silk and mulberry over the many now deserted farms. With their road to China blocked by the Ottomans, Europe was starved for luxuries, and anyone who could fill that void would become richer than they could possibly imagine, and so naturally, al-Din set about filling it. Yet, to achieve that dream, he needed labor, farm labor, and all of his people were dead. But just one mountain to the north, however, were a veritable sea of workers. The Christians, the Maronites, once his people's greatest enemy, now all but powerless in this post-Crusade world. And nothing if not a pragmatist, al-Din would recognize that manpower can still be found in men without power, and soon he began to hire as many Maronites as his fields could employ. Growth beget more growth, and more land required more labor, with more fields, more castles, and more need for control. But conversely, even as a tyrant, he inherently understood that his control, his very survival, relied on concessions, not abuse. To sustain his rule, al-Din presented a form of respect towards his Christian subjects that they hadn't felt since the French. In his lands, Maronites would be allowed to build churches, carry guns, and ride with saddles. They'd be paid a good wage, they'd be respected in public places, and in return, he'd let them tell the Catholics in Europe just how good he'd been acting. They'd be safe putting their faith in his friendship, buying his goods, and most of all, selling him their guns. Which meant that when the Medici, Europe's wealthiest family, decided that it was time for a crusade of their own, it was in al-Din where they'd place their hopes. Well, after he got rid of their first choice, that is. It would be under his leadership that for the first time in all Phoenician history, a local-born ruler would control the region of Lebanon in its entirety. And many therefore consider him to be the founding father of this nation, even though he died hundreds of years before it actually existed. And certainly, his memory remains highly respected among those who love this country. He might not have been perfect, granted, but he did set the stage for what it takes to rule here successfully. During his time in power, al-Din would promote a mixing of communities, of economies, and a sharing of bloodlines that lasted for generations. It wasn't exactly on equal terms, granted, as the Druze did remain the landlords, but at the very least, these two communities who'd been forced together for reasons of war were now finding reasons for peace. And so, of course, it almost goes without saying that the Ottomans beheaded him. After all, a man so capable, so close to the capital, could never survive for long. If you come at the king, they say, you'd better not miss. But that said, this is Lebanon, and it's rare here that something dies that doesn't come back, especially the landlords. That's the beauty of a Frankenstein. You cut off one head and they'll just sew on another, but for all those limbs below it, it wasn't hard to notice that none of the new heads that came after seemed to be quite as smart as his. Over the next few hundred years, things here only seemed to worsen. New heads might fall, but their taxes never seemed to. It was part imperial collapse and part imperial decree. After all, they couldn't exactly rebel if they didn't have any money. But you can't create a cancer and expect it not to spread, and by the 1800s, the problems of the limbs had started to reach the core, and soon enough, the empire itself was dying on its feet. The end had begun, and with the backing of European powers, soon every little region with their petty little tyrant had started to chip away at that stumbling corpse, each limb attempting to grab enough meat to survive once its body had died. They'd eventually begin to call this the sick man of Europe, but that's a bit of a misnomer because the true illness came out of Egypt. In Cairo, a powerful Albanian commander named Muhammad Ali began a rebellion that the Sultan simply could not control. And having crushed the local Mamluk governors who'd ruled since the time of Saladin, he stretched his arms in all directions. And what could the Ottomans do, really? He was far too powerful a governor for them to just put down, and so to sustain their power, they kind of had to pretend that he was still their man. It's just the more they backed down, the further he grew. And before long, his armies were at the borders of Lebanon, which left the local emir, a man named Bashir Shahab II, in a bit of a bind. The politics of his era are so confusing. I'm hesitant to even try to explain, but to put it as simply as I can, his power had once come from all sides, Maronite, Druze, Muslim, but he himself was a Christian. He was the first to ever be granted the title of emir in this region, and he'd only been given that position based on the belief that he could disarm the Christians without an uprising, and that was a belief that didn't exactly work out. So he'd been pushed into the arms of the Druze. But they weren't his base. And so, visibly weak, the governor of Sidon now saw a chance to expand his power and demanded more taxes from that emir than he ever dreamed of being able to pay. Taxes he would then exclusively squeeze from the now disarmed Maronites. After all, they were the only ones who couldn't fight back. At least not yet. But now completely hated by his own people, he would be forced to rely exclusively on the Druze to survive. And when they began to turn in their own time, he had nowhere else to go. In 1821, he fled to Egypt, one head cut off and another sewn on. But even in exile, his story was far from over, and in Cairo he'd ally with that rising Ali. As Egypt's soldiers rolled up through Lebanon, he'd be re-given those lands that he'd been forced from just a few years before, only now instead of crushing the Maronites, he'd be expected to do so to the Druze. A new ulema down in Cairo trying to prove itself through a new slaughter. I suppose an old slaughter. Which again put Bashir in a bit of a bind, because even with the armies of Egypt to support him, it's not like he had a lot of friends up here. He'd been ousted by the Muslims and betrayed by the Druze, and on top of that, he'd spent half his career oppressing the Christians, so why would anyone trust him? The only answer he could come up with was concessions. It's just that they happen to be sectarian concessions. He would choose one of the two sides and bribe them into submission. The pluralist memory of al-Din all but crushed in a single generation. From 1825 to 1840, he'd fill his administration almost exclusively with Maronites. He'd support their church, their clergy, and their politicians. Already the majority in population, they would now become a visible, public part of the system. What was once the near-exclusive rights of the Muslims were now in the hands of those second-class Christians. And it was a power that would only increase when in 1839 the Ottoman government started giving minorities equal rights. Well, that isn't to say they intended to enforce them, granted, but at least on paper, the rules had clearly changed. And so, with a strength that they hadn't felt in 700 years, the Christians of Lebanon started to flex. In other words, things started to look a lot like war. All that tinder just waiting for a spark, and colonial Europe, at the height of their power, realized that they were carrying a box full of matches. So in 1840, with the backing of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, Constantinople would finally force Ali back to Europe. Except in true European style, once they got their foot in that door, those allies had no true intention of leaving this land. Pretending that they now cared for the safety of the Druze, London began to publicly champion their cause. All that they asked in return was that they be allowed to send some missionaries to live among them, a new Protestant Abraham for these mountains of white. But to the Maronites next door, as well as the Orthodox alongside, this would be considered little less than a declaration of war. And so although the rule of the Druze had once been soft-handed and they'd saved these Christians from genuine destitution, the friendship that kept this land united for the past 300 years crumbled in under 20. Facing pressure from all sides, the arms of that Frankenstein simply began to cut each other off. And by 1860, that rising animosity would spark into an unfathomably bitter civil war. And quietly hoping that both sides would die equally, Constantinople merely sat back and watched, stoking the fires as they saw fit. Yet again, genocide would return to this land of resurrection. Only now it was the Christians' turn to die, and as the tide shifted against them, those Maronites would see over 10,000 of their citizens massacred in the coldest of blood. But as ever, this is Lebanon. And within that death would come back something long forgotten. Just as it had in 517, just as it had in 1071, news of that slaughter spread to Catholic Europe as if the deaths were their very own. And sensing an opportunity in the violence, the now mighty nation of France returned to the Mountains of White. With one of the most powerful armies on earth, Paris was now in a position to make some very serious demands, and they'd send 6,000 soldiers that they called peacekeepers to force Constantinople to put an end to the slaughter. And there, together with England, they'd devise a state within a state that the Ottomans would have otherwise never agreed to. In this newly minted state, those European powers would attempt to stabilize the lands that al-Din had once united. Only this time, they'd be ruled by the Maronites, not the Druze. The Christians might have lost the war, but those backing Europeans would make absolutely sure that they'd take home the spoils. At least, for a single generation, anyway. Because no longer just sick, but now truly terminal, the Ottomans joined the First World War with little way out but the grave. Over 4 short years, the empire that they'd amassed over the past 400 simply withered away and died, but not without taking everyone else down with them. As their head collapsed, the limbs began to go phantom, and as their society began to eat itself from the inside with the pressures of war and the evils of realpolitik, the people of Lebanon would face yet another horrific genocide. They call it the Kafno, or the Great Famine. Over just 3 years, from 1915 to 1918, the Maronites of this region would see a starvation that would kill nearly 50% of all people, a horror that has been virtually buried by the sands of time. Those who survived this unspeakable tragedy would see an entire generation of their people flee abroad. It would be the beginning of a mass migration that continues to shape Lebanon to this very day. But alongside those deaths, so too died their empire. And when the dust finally settled and the world returned to peace, France would vote their way back into ownership of Lebanon. And together with England, they'd split the entire region into ethnic enclaves, creating new states out of what were once little more than ideas. By 1920, they'd make it the law. With a small majority in population, France would enshrine Christian politicians ever so slightly above the rest. And so while the nation below them might remain pluralist, as long as France was in charge, no Maronite would ever be outvoted by either Muslims or the Druze. And so that ancient Frankenstein got a brand new head. The people licked their wounds, they started to rebuild, and they slowly began to dream of a world without horror. But this is Lebanon, and it's rare that something dies here and doesn't return. But more on that next time. This is Rare Earth.